a lot of you have been part of the BVSSH meetup group, and we've moved over to an open group, public group now to get more, welcome more people in, which is Sooner, Safer, Happier. So if you're joining from BVSSH, please have a look on Meetup for Sooner, Safer, Happier. Click to join that, because that's what we're going to be using in the future. So without further ado, really, we've got an hour together. I'm really super happy to welcome Patrick to our meetup, to the first one that I've been at. So it's fantastic, our inaugural Sooner, Safer, Happier one. And Patrick joins us. He's very, very well known to me. I've been at meetups with him before. A fantastic thought leader. Very well known in the Kanban world. I'm a big Kanban practitioner, as many of you will know. And in that world, Patrick has written books, one of the most notable ones being Upstream Kanban, about how we can shape and mold demand coming into our services to optimize them. Also, with his partner, oh, sorry, I'm just looking around to see if she's on. Yeah, Arlette is here as well. She's joined on the screen there. You can see her there. So along with Arlette, runs Okaloa Flow Lab, and many of you will have played the Okaloa Flow Lab game, which is a big part of a great simulation to understand Kanban and flow in organizations. I'll stop wittering on now, and I'll hand over to Patrick so he can start his talk and share with us a fantastic talk on finding authentic wholeness in new ways of working, something very close to all of our hearts. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks for the invitation. So I was really glad that for the invitation, and then also when I saw the announcement with the Sooner, Safer, Happier logo. And I thought, like, this is a perfect fit with the talk, actually. So I was really glad about that. So what I'm going to do is run through this poster that we are creating. Now, this is work in progress. Matt can testify that the version that I used previously is already an older version, so it keeps on evolving. I ask a little bit of your, what I call it, not your patience, but your compassion, maybe, or well, maybe not compassion, but forgiveness, in the sense that it's not an easy topic that I'm trying to talk about. In the sense that what we're trying to do is make something that is very intangible and try to make it more tangible. But then at the same time, we don't want to make it too tangible, because it does need to stay a little bit intangible also. And so that's part of the difficulty of talking about this. Also, if you look at my background, things like upstream Kanban, very tangible things, and then now we're trying to broaden this up, and then I take a broader view, which is more related to what we're doing with Flow Lab, which is also quite new for us. So what we're going to try to do is take a little bit of a broader view on agility, in the sense that as a practitioner, things are not easy. There's multiple concerns that you need to take into account, and what we're trying to offer is a way of how to integrate all those multiple concerns, how to integrate it into an authentic whole, so that you're more effective, more successful as a practitioner. Now, let me start with a warm-up question. You can use the chat to answer. When you are working at your best, it is like what? So working at your best is like what for you? So you can follow in the chat what others are saying. So immersive, easy, energizing, flow, fun, exciting, time flies, learning at the same time as producing. So we're achieving multiple goals at the same time. Collaborative. I'd rather be doing that work as pretty much anything else in the moment. And then in the moment, I think, is a good phrase, being in the moment. So this is a question that we often ask at the beginning of a workshop. And this is very representative in terms of what the answer is. So it appears that there's something universal that is going on here. People do tend to like answer in the same category of things. That category being somewhere along the lines of, if you think about it in terms of sports, being in the zone, not just as an individual, as depicted here, but also maybe as a team, being in the zone, as say a basketball team or a football team or a soccer team. So being in the zone, or in terms of the psychology of flow, not sure whether you're familiar with that, but in terms of, on the one hand, having skills, and the other hand, having a challenge. And if skills and challenge are high and matched with each other, you feel like in this flow state. Or you can go back to ancient China, where this idea of effortless action, action is quite effortless. So things like if all are in that area. I like. Do you know the Butcher Ding story?
No.
No.
So this is an old story about a butcher, Chinese story about a butcher that didn't have to sharpen his knife for 17 years. Yeah. While most of the other butchers have to sharpen their knife every week or something, he didn't have to sharpen his knife for 17 years. And that's what effortless action stands for. Yeah. You know why he didn't have to sharpen his knife for 17 years, for that long period?
He never made it blunt.
He never made it blunt. Yeah. He never touched the bones of when he was carving up an animal. He was so skillful that he never ever touched any of the hard parts of the animal. Kind of like the animal just fell apart in front of his eyes, right? He really felt where he had to carve. So that's like effortless action. If change only could be like that. Yeah. So I think you're getting the picture. So what I'm going to do is use this as a metaphor for a new way of working. So we think about this mostly on the individual level, but we can also imagine this at the organizational level, right? Where the organization is like can do its business in a very effortless way, where the entire organization is in the zone, where you can adapt to circumstances in like a very fluent way, right? So I use it as a metaphor because that gives a little bit of a holistic picture But at the same time, it also points out the paradox that we are faced with. Suppose that I tell you, Patrick or Matt, sorry, I'm not talking to myself, but Matt, tomorrow we have this important meeting. I want you to be in the zone.
There's pressure.
What will happen? Can I command you to be in the zone?
Probably doing that would make me feel a bit self-aware and stop me from getting in it, I suppose.
So can I command you or tell you how to be in the zone? Can I give you a, go ahead.
I was just going to probably give me your perspective of what it would mean to be in the zone for you.
Yeah. If I would prescribe you a 5-step plan to be in the zone, would that work?
Well, maybe that'd give me more of an idea, but still, it's going to be bit of self-actualization needed, I think, isn't it?
Yeah. No. So that's kind of the paradox of trying hard not to try, right? The quality of being in the zone is exactly that. It's spontaneous. Yeah. The harder you try, the less likely it is that you will get there. If you try too hard, you'll become self-aware, as you said, and then that self-awareness actually takes you out of the zone, out of that state. And if you take that metaphor as a metaphor, not just for a personal, an individual thing, but for an entire organization, can I tell you to be agile? Yeah. Probably the harder that I tell you to be agile, the less likely it is that you are becoming agile, right? So this is kind of the paradox, and it has to do with some the way the brain functions. If I tell you don't think of an elephant, okay, and if I tell you that a couple of times, don't think of an elephant, then probably you'll start thinking of an elephant. If I tell you don't be self-aware, probably you'll start to become very self-aware. The best way of if you're doing like an individual competition, one-on-one competition, if you want to get your opponent out of the zone, just asking him or her a detail about his performance, so that he or she will become self-aware, and a big chance that that person will drop out of the zone. So that's kind of the paradox that I think that is a very deep paradox that we are in. And I think today this brings us into this impasse, in this impossible situation where we keep on flipping, and it's like flip-flopping between, yes, we need recipes, we need methods. Well, no, we don't need methods. Well, yeah, no, yes, we need methods. No, we don't need methods. It's not about doing this new way of working. But then if it's not about doing, it's about being, but then how do you start? And yeah, where's the recipe for starting? And then we get all kinds of recipes for not using methods. And so that's kind of the impasse. Snowden has this beautiful word, aporia. Yeah. The aporia that we are in. And the harder we try, the worse it gets. And it seems that it's getting worse and worse and worse. If you go on the social media platforms, I think you're witnessing exactly this this movement, this flip-flop behavior. You'll see that plenty. Yeah. So next step is that we say, well, it's not about the doing, it's not about the being, it's about the becoming, right? It's not about the form, the practices. It's not about just the being. What is agility? But it's about the adapting to the context. It's about becoming. Yeah. And before we know it, somebody starts talking about the shuhari concept, and we start interpreting it as a recipe. And now we start looking for recipes of becoming. Yeah. And so it seems to be quite inescapable, or at least there's quite some danger in terms of how do you escape that idea of turning everything into a recipe, which doesn't bring us into working at our best, yeah, which doesn't solve the paradox that we're trying to solve. So what I will start doing is start discussing using Agile as a case, as a pointing case of new ways of working, and illustrate maybe an alternative path, yeah, based on insights rather than on recipes, on learning, on gaining new insights rather than on recipes. Obviously, the pitfall would be that this would be turned into a recipe, right? But I think that's not going to be easy. Yeah. So what I'll do is I'll start from two angles. One angle is the angle of Agile, and the other angle is the angle of agility. Now, for you, Agile is like what? Agility is like what? And what is the difference? Because on social media, again, and in presentations, we've seen people making that difference between Agile and agility. It's not about Agile, it's about agility. What is that difference for you? So agility is the outcome. Agile is the practices. Agility is using them well. Agile is a concept. Agility is a movement. Agile seems to be represent the being and the doing. Agility, it's an outcome in terms of giving the ability to pivot and change, right? And I like Matt's definition. So there seems to be like this general understanding that Agile is more about what you do, more about the practices, and then agility is more of an outcome. So what I'll do is I'll explore two parts. One part starting from the practices. Yeah, so that's the top right. And then the other part is I'll start exploring it from the outcomes in terms of value creation, learning, so dealing with uncertainty, stuff like that. But what we'll see is we'll end up in the same place, essentially. Yeah, we'll end up in the same place. We'll come to the same conclusion. So the doing part. So for me, that's represented by the methods, right? So my simple definition, and you can interrupt me if you want to. My simple definition is, or maybe a simplistic definition is, a method is just a fixed set of practices and principles with the understanding, or at least the expectation, that when you apply the practices as intended and with respect to the principles, you'll get some outcome, right? So that's trying to boil it down to its essence. Now, people sometimes talk about frameworks rather than methods, and I honestly often don't see the difference, but that might be my problem. So, for example, the assumption is that when you apply the Scrum practices while respecting the Agile principles or the Scrum principles, that leads to what Jeff Sutherland calls hyperproductivity, right? I think that's the Scrum promise, right? If you apply the Kanban practices and you respect the Kanban principles, that leads to more flow, let's say. So that's in short the method perspective. Now, the truth of the matter is that even if we respect the principles, practices only produce an outcome in a certain context. Right? Context is like, you can't ignore context. Context is crucial. Introducing agile engineering practices like XP engineering practices in a non-agile organization surely feels very different from trying to introduce agile engineering practices in a startup, in an agile startup, right? The results are going to be quite different, right? Introducing Scrum practices in a startup versus introducing Scrum practices in a large organization, or in an organization where HR is very traditional, or versus HR that is already very agile or agile minded. Surely the results are going to be quite different. So we cannot ignore context. So that for me is the difference between a practice and a capability, right? So I'm introducing this terminology of a capability here. So a capability is, unlike a practice, a capability is something that you can repeatedly produce outcomes, even in variable circumstances, right? So if I can do a little trick with my, if I'm a soccer player and I can do a little trick with a ball, that's a practice. If I consistently can bypass another player, an opponent player, if I can do that with different players in different circumstances, that's for me a capability, right? And surely it's not about practices. It's about capabilities. That's what we're after. And then the most important, if you look at agility, being able to operate in different contexts, in evolving contexts, even in adverse contexts, you might say that is really core to agility. And obviously the capability to evolve and develop new capabilities is actually is the really crucial capability, right? Yeah. So we're after capabilities and not practices. Now we are quite lucky. Some of these practices have a special role to play. Things that we call practices, but they're actually quite special. In Scrum, we have something that is called a time box, like a sprint time box. In Kanban, we've got something like that is called we call it a practice, limiting WIP. But they play a very special role in the sense that they are not just something you do, they are a constraint that you impose on yourself, right? If you think about the time box, you are imposing a constraint on yourself in terms of we are going to deliver something valuable in 14 days. Okay. If you think about limiting WIP, it's a constraint that you impose on yourself, saying that we are not going to work on 7 work items, more than 7 work items as a team at the same time. Yeah. So these constraints, and we call them enabling constraints, in the sense that they enable a certain capability to emerge. If I take the example of WIP limits, they enable us the capability of being able to defer commitment to emerge. Yeah. If I limit the WIP, my lead time will become shorter. If my lead time is short enough, I can defer the commitment. I can tell the customer, we're not going to start it now. We will start it at the last responsible moment. Right. Any idea what time boxes enable in Scrum? What does the time box enable?
Feedback loops.
Feedback loops. Fast feedback. Enables us to learn rapidly from the customer. Yeah. So they're a very special type of practices, right? They're constraints. Now, what those constraints also do is that they expose a certain tension, right? If you start introducing Kanban, for example, in a team, they'll start what is typically called resist the change. But what they're actually surfacing, they're not resisting change. What they're surfacing is a certain tension. Yeah. On the one hand, from the demand side, from the customer side, we are very interested in having short lead times, right? There's a need for having short lead times to be able to react quickly. But from the supply side, from, let's say, the management side, we want to have people being busy. Okay. How many organizations do you know where people can come to a daily stand-up and say, today, I'm not going to work. I'm going back home because we have too much work in progress. Yeah. So I'm not going to start some new work. Okay. So we need some slack in here. So for the sake of the team, for the sake of the organization, I am going to enjoy the beach. Yeah. That's not very acceptable in most organizations. In fact, I don't know of any organization where that would be acceptable. Yeah. Idle time is taboo. Yeah. It's impossible to talk about people being idle, right? So what those team members are actually, if you start introducing a constraint like a WIP limit, what those team members are going to surface is the tension between, on the one hand, the organizational culture that says, like, from a supply side, we want to keep everybody busy. And on the other hand, the desire, the need to have shorter lead times, and that tension will surface. Okay. Obviously, what we're next going to do is we're going to mark that as resistance to change, and then we're going to apply our entire toolbox of change management techniques to break that resistance. Yeah. Rather than actually facing up to the fact that that is a tension that is there, and that we should be to see how we can cope with that tension, right? What would be the tension that surfaces when you introduce time boxes? It's been an endless discussion in the Scrum community, if I'm correct. On the one hand, we want commitment to reach that time box. On the other hand, we have uncertainty in terms of, yeah, can we deliver this in 14 days? Yeah, and this has been an endless discussion in the, as far as I know, I'm not too deep in the Scrum community, but as far as I know, that has been an endless discussion in the Scrum community. Yeah. Now, luckily for us, some patterns have emerged to deal with those tensions, right? In the Kanban community, for example, the pattern emerged in terms of a number of practices that may create an improvement, like managing your blockers. Okay? If you manage your blockers well, the things that block your items in the flow, if you manage your blockers well, you reduce your impediments. So that means that you can turn that WIP policy in an active WIP constraint. Okay? Because work is less blocked, yeah, you can stay within that WIP constraint. Okay? And so you can manage the tension in the sense that you can reduce your WIP, you can shorten the lead times without increasing your idle time, right? So a certain set of practices that help to turn those policies, like the WIP policy, into an active constraint that results in the realization of an outcome, in this case, shorter lead times, the desired thing, and an outcome that, if we consistently produce it, creates a certain capability, in this case, the capability to defer commitment. Did we see similar patterns forming around, or another pattern like this forming around time boxing? Yeah. Did we see a pattern like this forming around time boxing? Well, I think so. I think so, in the sense that time boxing creates that tension between commitment and uncertainty. And how do we deal with that tension? With that tension is by having optionality in our sprint scope, in the scope that we put in our time box. Okay. In Scrum, that is expressed as it's the sprint goal that is important. It's not the sprint backlog, right? That means that there is optionality. Okay. And so if you have optionality, that means that you can tune. It's the very old iron triangle, the project management iron triangle, scope, time, and effort. And you need to pick one. In this case, we pick the scope as being flexible, right? In that sense, we can fit into the time box, even if we encounter adversity. And so that we can have a predictably frequent delivery, so that we can frequently integrate all the work, not only within the team, but also across the teams, and so that we can have frequent feedback, right? So again, a pattern emerged. If I go back here, I can safely call this a pattern in the sense that it's not a fixed practice, in the sense that it's a pattern that can be seen in many different forms. If you look at just the constraining of WIP, there's many different ways of constraining the WIP, right? You can have a cap WIP, a con WIP, a personal WIP, a column WIP limit, like in the Kanban method. You can have order points, cap tokens, customer Kanban, all kinds of different ways of constraining the WIP, which leads to all kinds of different instantiations of this pattern. In the time boxing, you can have sprint time box, but that's not the only type of time box that we can have. We can also have a task time box, right? And we can have we can box the paper size, like in A3 thinking, right? Or using a canvas like the business model canvas, which creates a boundary in which we need to work, right? Around the collaboration, we also saw a pattern emerging, and I think the XP community has been groundbreaking in that, in the sense that when you're around the collaboration, we have this tension between like specialization and we want to have like high specialization, people that know a certain job very well, but at the same time we want to have highly flexible people, right? And so a certain pattern has emerged in there too, in terms of having synchronized cadences, so that people work in a synchronized way, so that we can work in small cells, like pairs or mobs. And then if people work very closely together, yeah, they share competencies, they learn from each other, so that we can technically what is called staff liquidity, but you could also call it T-shaped profiles or whatever you want to call it, that you have more overlapping competencies between people. Yeah. Which leads to the capability of collaborative improvement, right? So different patterns have emerged like this. Now the question to you is, which of these patterns is now the true Agile pattern? Which of these patterns is a true Agile? Because if I believe some of the thought leaders in some of the communities, we need to select. We need to say, this is the true Agile pattern. So which one is the true Agile pattern? Is it the pattern around constraining a whip? Is it the pattern around time boxing? Is it the pattern around working in cells? Which one is now the true Agile pattern?
A provocative question. I mean, it depends on the context, I would suppose. Which one would rise to the top that's needed the most at that any given moment?
Yeah, depends on the context.
Yeah, to build on the top of what Matt said, I believe the right practice is when applied to a context, gives a certain capability.
Yeah. Yeah. So it depends on the context, right? Any other opinions? Anyone that wants to like play the devil's advocate and say that?
Yeah. Why would you have to choose?
Why would you have to choose?
Why is one of them? Why couldn't it be all of them? Why are they not all?
Why not all? Why not all? Now, what if I say that each of these patterns, the context is important, right? Each of these patterns provides a context to each other. Okay. Does limiting WIP the pattern of flow, does that provide a context for the pattern of learning?
Yeah. I mean, it allows you to notice things, doesn't it? It allows you to learn. If you're swamped with stuff, it's very difficult.
If you're swamped with stuff, probably your lead times are going to be very long. So it means that your feedback cycles are very long, very hard to learn in that type of environment. Does collaboration provide a context for the pattern of flow? Does the pattern of collaboration provide a context for the pattern of flow?
Yeah, definitely. Because if you're collaborating, then the chances are you're going to finish work sooner, which will result in less WIP, which will result in less lead times, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. One might actually say that it's impossible to create flow without that collaboration, right? If that team member comes to the team meeting, your daily stand-up, and says like, I'm going to the beach because I'm blocked. Yeah, the alternative could be like, can I help somebody else, right? Can I collaborate? Okay. What is one of the impediments for flow is Keyman dependencies, bottlenecks, right? Now, if I have higher staff liquidity, if my overlapping competencies become higher, I am less subject to Keyman dependencies. I'm less subject to bottlenecks. Okay. So the way we collaborate as a team is an important context for creating flow. Would flow create a context for collaboration?
If you've not got flow, does it put the spotlight on the need to collaborate?
Yeah. If I see a team, I see a team of 7 persons, and I look at their board, and those 7 persons have a WIP of, let's say, 25. How is that team collaborating, do you think?
Not very well.
Not very well. Okay. So now you're going to ask them to collaborate. They each have individually, they're swamped with work. Okay. And now you're going to ask to collaborate. What do you think that they will say? We don't have time to collaborate. Right? But we have so many tasks individually. Why should I collaborate? Right. So it's not just that the horses for courses, it's not just horses for courses. It's not just like you need to pick the right pattern in the right context. No. Each of these patterns provide a context for each other. We can think of them in a separate way, and we've been doing that for quite a while, right? But at the same time, they are inseparable. Each of these patterns in their own might not be the best idea, but if you combine them, they might become very powerful. Okay, this is actually what Ken Beck said in his the first edition of the XP book about the XP practices. Each of these practices individually might not be very powerful, but if you combine them, they balance each other's out. Yeah, they cover each other's weaknesses. Yeah. So from the practices standpoint, and this is what we capture in the Agile capabilities model, we come to the conclusion that, well, there are 3 patterns that we identified. A pattern around flow, a pattern around learning, a pattern around collaboration. And then recognizing the fact that practices only produce an outcome in a certain context. Also, these patterns only produce an outcome or a capability in a certain context. Now, the funny thing is that they provide a context to each other. Okay? They are interdependent, each of these patterns. We can think of them as in separate ways, but actually, essentially, they are inseparable. Okay? They are inseparable. I'm not going to explain this model in detail. We've explained a little bit of the components individually, and we've explained how they fit together. There's more detail, but we don't. It would take us too far in explaining it. What I'm going to do is look at it from the other side now. Look at it from the side of agility, not from doing Agile, but from agility, the outcome, the emergent outcomes. And then the question is, what kind of outcomes? Okay. Now the first outcome, or the first, desired capability that we're going to talk about is obviously the thing of value creation. Agility has to do with value creation, right? The purpose of an organization is to create value, right? And hopefully agility is about creating that value. So this brings in the perspective, kind of like the market perspective. The perspective of an organization as there's demand on the one hand and there's supply on the other. And the purpose of the organization is to match that demand with that supply, right? Demands coming in from the customers, supply coming in from the people that actually do the work. Yeah. And so the purpose of the organization is to match those two, right? Knowing that, especially in an agile context, demand is not a fixed thing. It's gonna fluctuate. It's gonna change. At some periods in time, they want red widgets, and then suddenly the next month everybody wants blue widgets. Yeah. So demand is going to change, and sometimes change drastically, right? And so somehow we need to cope with that. And so one way of coping with that is to make sure that our supply side, our delivery capability is flexible so that we can cope with that fluctuating demands, right? But at the same time, we know that that flexibility has its limits, right? You can be only so flexible, right? We can staff up, we can staff down, we can multi-skill, but there's going to be limits to it. So there's also going to need to be an element of creating and shaping demands to make sure that we optimally use our constrained delivery capability, right? Now this is a flow perspective, right? This is the flow perspective. We see that there's an interdependency between supply and demand. You cannot think about supply and demand separately. Does it make sense to have a supply when there's no demand? Okay. Can there be a demand if there's no supply? There can be a need. There can be a need, but there's no actual a potential demand. But there's there cannot be an actual demand if there's no supply. Okay. If there's no supply for windmills, then a market for windmills cannot take shape. Yeah. So there's an interdependency between supply and demand. And that interdependency, as I said, the demand side will fluctuate. The supply side will be constrained, and that interdependency will create turbulence in the flow. Always. There's always going to be some kind of turbulence in the flow. The flow being the continuous creation of value for the customer. Yeah, because there's always going to be fluctuation, and because there's always going to be constraints on the supply side. However we organize. Yeah. So this brings in the flow perspective and the realization that there's always going to be some kind of turbulence. Now, is that the only perspective? Is that creating value? Is that the only thing that agility is about? What else would it be about?
Employee satisfaction.
Employee satisfaction. We'll come back to that.
Customer satisfaction.
Dealing with uncertainty, yeah. Right? I would consider dealing with uncertainty is also an important aspect. Recognizing the fact that things are complex, things are the famous VUCA world. Yeah. So recognizing that we all tend to, 90% of our time we live downstream. Downstream meaning not on the delivery side, but downstream in our thinking. Applying the common ways. If we make breakfast, we make breakfast in a certain way. So 90% of the time we are downstream in terms of applying the common knowledge, going around with our business as usual, right? But then 10% of the time we need to go upstream. Yeah, we need to become creative. Rather than assuming that if there's a friction and we can always isolate that friction and then find a recipe to deal with that friction. If we go upstream, those 10% of the times, we need to let go of that assumption and we need to recognize that frictions are connected and that we need to have some novel thinking in order to deal with those frictions, right? That's the uncertainty, the complexity that we need to deal with, right? So not just applying common ways, but uncovering new ways. Not just selling our existing products, but finding out new markets, right? So this is the learning perspective. So also upstream and downstream are interdependent with each other. The Agile Manifesto says we are uncovering better ways. That's core to Agile, uncovering better ways. But the problem is often that we start downstream, right? With what others have uncovered. And as we go back upstream, we've discovered that things are not fixed, not isolated. They are ever evolving and they are interconnected. And so we uncover better ways to deal with that. But then those better ways again become common ways, right? And so upstream and downstream are quite interconnected, interdependent to each other. And it's those that interdependency that constitutes our learning. Yeah? That's where the learning starts to emerge from there. We deliver something, a downstream activity, in order to get feedback, to learn an upstream activity, and that's iteration. That's inspect and adapt first, right? So also that is an aspect of agility, right? And then the third aspect of agility, self-organization, right? Self-organizing teams. This firm belief in simple rules as a way to organize quite complex social behavior, the complex social behavior of running a business. So very popular, right? And so thinking in terms of an organization as a network rather than a hierarchy, and associated with this idea of employee satisfaction, associated with this notion of autonomy, right? That is a large part of motivation. So clearly that's also an aspect of agility, right? So we're thinking about not hierarchical organizations, but hierarchical organizations, right? So does that mean that hierarchy is out? That it's all about networks, hierarchy? Does that mean that hierarchy is like out of the door?
Does it depend again what context you're in? You know, if you're in an organization where you've got a hierarchy, you know, you can't just change and say, you know, tomorrow we're going to have no hierarchy. So is it about the context and working within that context to challenge some of the thinking there?
Yeah. So maybe we need to give the same answer. Hierarchy and hierarchy give context to each other. They are interdependent. Have you seen the Scrum of Scrums picture? The Scrum of Scrums, the Scrum of Scrums of Scrums. Wouldn't that be a hierarchy? Yeah. So I love this quote by Herbert Simon. It says like, everything is connected, but some things are more connected than others, right? If you have units in an organization that interact with each other, okay, so the organization emerges out of that interaction. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. Yeah. But at the same time, that organization does impose constraints on those units, right? And so the units and the organization are in a hierarchical interdependence. Okay, we've got people in teams, we've got teams in teams of teams, we've got teams of teams in organizations. Okay, maybe it's not a hierarchy based on authority or power, but it is a hierarchy. Yeah. And so the collaboration emerges out of that interdependence between that network of interactions, the hierarchy, and that hierarchy. Yeah, how they interdepend with each other. Yeah. So if I would say we're gonna divide everything in feature teams, we're gonna carve up the organization around feature teams. Does that mean that all those feature teams are independent from each other? No. Okay. So there's still going to be an interaction. There's still going to be an aspect of flow across those feature teams. Yeah. So this brings to the point of these things are also entangled, right? If I look at value creation, self-organization, dealing with uncertainty, which one is the strategic one? How would you order them from more strategic to more operational? Which one would be more strategic and which one would be more operational?
You can't separate them, can you?
You can't separate them.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I was explaining to flow concepts to somebody that was very much into self-organization. I said, yeah, but you know what? The circular management, consent decision-making, that's strategic. The flow stuff, that's operational. That's for the teams, right? Okay, so value creation is not strategic. Then I would say, well, for me, you know what? Value creation is strategic for for the organization. And let's say that all that self-organizing stuff, that's for the teams, and that's operational. Yeah. Then the learning part, well, that's for the digital part of our organization. That's for the innovation cell. Yeah. Yeah. Well, no, they're inseparable. Okay. They're inseparable. There's a law of physics. It's a little bit contested maybe, but still it's a law of physics that says that any flow system, in order to persist, needs to have the degrees of freedom to evolve, to better, to improve the currents that are imposed on it. So this is Adrien Bejan. So any flow system to persist in an organization, I think we can agree, is a flow system. It's value creation. An organization is a flow system, whether you want it or not, whether you like the Kanban method or not, it doesn't matter. An organization is a flow system. There's supply, there's demand, and value needs to flow across supply and demand. Okay. So if it is a flow system, as a flow system, in order to persist, it needs to have the degrees of freedom to improve the currents that are imposed on it. What is the current that is imposed on an organization as a flow system? A fluctuating demand, right? What are the degrees of freedom that the organization needs to have in order to better organize around or to better to improve the currents that are imposed on it? What are the degrees of freedom that the organization has? Its organization, how it is structured, right? So maybe one kind of structure today, let's say feature teams, a certain set of feature teams is quite well at dealing with the currents that are imposed on the organization. But if the demand changes, yeah, we need to adapt our structure. Yeah. Maybe we need to create a feature of feature teams or a meta feature team. I don't know. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So flow, collaboration, learning, they are interdependent to each other. They are entangled with each other. Yeah. So again, when looking at agility, just like when looking at Agile, we see three interconnected patterns. Yeah. And so the wholeness that we're looking for is not just the wholeness in terms of self-organizing teams. Yeah. Like in the teal organization. Yeah. I think the wholeness is in recognizing the interdependence, recognizing that flow, collaboration, learning are three equal partners. Yeah. They are interdependent to each other. There's no hierarchy in there. Yeah. There's also no choice in there. Yeah. They are interconnected with each other. They are interdependent. And so any sustainable change needs to take that into account. If you go into an organization and the only thing that you have is a hammer, you will look for nails, right? And then you will find nails to hammer on. And if there's no nails, you will tell the organization, you have nails. Your screws are nails. And I'll hammer them in for you. Yeah. Okay. If the only perspective that you have as a coach is the flow perspective, you will find a flow problem in the organization. Yeah. If the only perspective that you have is a collaboration perspective, you will find a collaboration problem in the organization. And if there's no collaboration problem, you will tell them that there's a collaboration problem. Yeah. If the only thing that you have is learning, validated learning, whatever, inspect and adapt, if that's the only tool that you have, the only perspective that you have, you will make sure that the organization has a learning problem. Yeah. Because that's the value that you can bring. Yeah. Is that sustainable change? I don't think so. Yeah. Sustainability comes from the fact that you integrate those different perspectives. You might
have a devil's advocate question.
Yeah, go ahead.
If I could. So, how much does that matter? So I get what you're saying, and obviously I love the model, but because they're so interconnected, if you do perceive it as a learning, we're saying that they're that interconnected that you can't affect any change in learning unless you're affecting change in flow and collaboration. Yes. What it probably comes down to is, hopefully, if you're the person going in there with the hammer, you learn that actually, the top comes off and you've got a screwdriver. You learn that by intervening maybe in learning and focusing on that, you're affecting flow, you're affecting collaboration. If you've only got that vocabulary to talk about in terms of learning, if they're that interconnected, you would still be positive. Well, you would still be affecting them, hopefully positively.
Yeah, any good coach will be able to navigate. Will be able to navigate that. Now, it does help. It does help to make your model explicit.
Yes.
As a coach, it does help to make your model explicit. It can be challenged. It can be shared. And you can also challenge yourself, right? If I'm honest, I'm a flow person, right? I feel very comfortable when it comes to flow, right? And I need to collaborate with other coaches when it comes to collaboration, right? And I feel that collaboration is an interdependency. It's not like what you see in many organizations today. We've got the flow coach, we've got the collaboration coach, and they're doing their own separate things, right? Because I think if you admit it, we all have our certain perspective. Yeah, we all have a certain perspective. Now, making your model explicit does help in terms of becoming aware of your own perspective, right? And then allowing others to challenge it.
Or help where you have a weakness, as you say, and collaborate to cover the rest of the things. If, like yourself and like me, flow is something that you gravitate towards.
Yes, and that's okay. That's okay. But then knowing your own blind spot does make you a lot more effective. No?
Super.
And so in the same way that flow, collaboration, learning are interdependent, are entangled with each other. So form, content, and context are entangled with each other also. So there is no shu-hari recipe. It's a strange loop. You start with some form, you develop some you can challenge the model a little bit, and then adapt it to the context, and before you know it, you find yourself in the same place, and you start all over again, right? And that's how the true learning happens. It's not a sequential thing, right? It's a very strange loop. So things are interdependent, are entangled with each other. Yeah. So in my that's the wrong way. In my coaching, I make my model explicit, right? And also for myself, I make my model explicit in terms of I'm going in from a flow perspective, maybe, and then I see collaboration that is a constraint. The way people in the organization are collaborating is a constraint in terms of how we are creating our ability to create flow in the organization. So how can we address that constraint? And then maybe in order to address that constraint, there's an even deeper constraint in terms of how people in the organization are learning. And then again, how can we, and then I might end up back in on the flow side again. Yeah. Yeah. So it helps you focus on the essence. It helps you address the real concerns in terms of capabilities. What are the real flow problems? What are the real collaboration problems? What are the real learning problems that we're seeing in the organization? Rather than doing the practices and then preaching a mindset. And in terms of the type of change, it gives a really different dynamic on the change, on the level of how you change change happens in the organization. So it's like building bridges while walking on it. Huh? Yeah, you're trying to understand things while you're trying to understand things. My answer, and it's not a recipe, is we cannot see the whole, because if we could see the whole, then the whole would be like as tangible as the parts, but we can try to grasp for it. We can recognize that there are different perspectives. I enjoy working with coaches that have a complete different perspective than I have, even a perspective that I don't understand. Yeah. Think dynamically, not just dynamically in terms of how things evolve, yeah, but also dynamically in terms of, so a lot of this has to do with observation, right? Observing how things are being able to observe. And we need to admit that if we observe things, we all have our own lenses. Yeah? Becoming aware of your own lenses, that's thinking dynamically. Yeah? Observing your own observing. Yeah? Where am I limiting myself to a certain lens? Yeah? And is that constructive? Is that functional? Okay. And then once in a while, go upstream. Be creative. Don't follow the standard recipes. Yeah. And then just do something wild. Yeah. So the real power horse, I think, here is this. That's the real power horse. Can you do systems thinking without a notation? Like you have the notation of causal loop diagrams and stuff like that. Huh? Can you do systems thinking without a notation, like causal loop diagram notation? Can you do that? Yeah, of course. You can be aware of causal loops without being able to write them down, right? It's possible, okay? But it does help to have a notation, yeah? Okay? Can you do contingent thinking without a notation? And with contingent thinking, I mean the thinking that where you take context explicitly into account. We say that context is so important, and at all times we need to take context explicitly into account. Okay. Can you do contingent thinking without a notation? Yes, you can, but it does help to have a notation. Okay. The notation that I used, I didn't really introduce it, but I just started using it, is this notation of say C produces D in the context of B, right? Yeah. So in the context of limiting your WIP, yeah. So managing the blockers produces shorter lead times. Yeah. Now, if we have that, if we have that notation, we can start thinking about making mutual contingency explicit. Right. Okay. The mutual contingency between, for example, the flow and the collaboration pattern. Yeah. And then we can abstract away from that in terms of making the interdependency explicit. A potential supply creates an actual supply in the context of an actual demand. An actual demand creates a potential demand creates an actual demand in the context of an actual supply. That's a mutual contingency that shows us the interdependency between supply and demand. You cannot only have supply when you have demand. You can only have demand when you have supply. Yeah, they create each other's existence. That's interdependency, right? Not just dependency in terms of things are connected, but interdependency in the sense that the one only exists if the other exists. Flow only exists if there's collaboration. Collaboration only exists if there's learning. Yeah? Learning only exists if there's flow. Yeah. Now, if you express it like that, yeah, it is clear that flow only exists when there's collaboration. Yeah. So you might think of the flow coach as a little bit of an, yeah. How is that possible? Yeah. And then looking at interdependencies of interdependencies, yeah, entanglement. Things are really entangled because you've got interdependencies of interdependencies. So that notation, and then if you go back, so here, yeah, helps us to make our model explicit. Yeah, so I don't think that that notation is really a part of the powerhouse of what it's about. Cool.
Lovely. That's brilliant. When you were talking then about, you know, one of them doesn't exist on their own, it's a lovely model and it's a lovely articulation. It makes me think that actually, so, you know, I'll go in as a flow coach. Buy one, you get two free. You get your collaboration coach. Get everything else bolted in. We'll start in one place, but you're piling in so much else without you even knowing. Look at what you're getting. You're getting all this flow, all this learning, all this collaboration.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I would say that having all those three perspectives in the same person, I would challenge that idea. I don't think it's possible.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I agree. Like you say there, working with other coaches, having varied strengths, spotting each other's blind spots. I think that's a fantastic thing to do. Yeah. And I've noted there's someone on here who I've worked like that with, Tom Ayers, if he's still here. I know we've sort of run over time, but I've worked in a sort of a triumvirate with Tom, who's in the audience in a very similar way, very effectively with another chap called Steve. And it's very fulfilling, and it's the whole is much more than the sum of the parts.
Yeah.
Completely agree with that. Yeah.
Does that relate to, there's a concept called cognitive dissonance, isn't there, where you can hold more than one thing in your head that are opposing at the same time?
Yeah.
And yeah, maybe it's easy if there's maybe 2 things, but more difficult if there's 3, like you've got here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, it's being able to hold multiple conflicting ideas in your mind is part and parcel for this. Yeah. So you're continuously conflicted between supply and demand, conflicted between hierarchy and hierarchy, conflicted between doing agile and being agile. Yeah. And then being able to hold those conflicting ideas in your head is actually part of it's crucial. But then there's only so much conflicting ideas that you can hold in your head at the same time. Because,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Patrick. I'm going to stop the recording now. Just we're running on a bit like we're all hanging on every word for that. So it was absolutely fascinating. I'm sure we'll be using this model in future. So I'll stop the recording there.
Yeah. So wait, before you stop.
Oh, sorry.
I don't know if the poster is already on there, but it's going to be here on the, if you scan that QR code, then it's going to be on our website.
Fantastic. I'll wait for everyone to scan that. It will be on the recording now as well, so you can catch up with that.
Voila.
And I'll take a copy and I'll post it when we post up tomorrow.